Meanwhile, the Serbian population of Mostar, the capital of Herzegovina, was virtually eliminated in violent attacks by combined Muslim and Croatian forces in June of 1992. But with the exception of the British Guardian, this event went unnoticed in the West.
Mostar presented an enormous problem because it was even more dangerous than Sarajevo. In fact, there are many in the United Nations and those observers within Bosnia who say that the situation in Mostar was far worse than Sarajevo, if that's possible. It almost seems hard to imagine.
Some of the worst atrocities were undertaken by Muslim paramilitary units in eastern Bosnia against Serbian villages such as Kamenica and Milici. Bloody Serbian reprisals in Srebrenica made international headlines in 1995, but for the first 3 years of the war, Srebrenica was the stronghold of Muslim warlord Nasser Oric, who drove out the Serbian population and carried out scores of massacres against surrounding villages, including the killing of 500 Serbian civilians on Orthodox Christmas Eve in 1993. That by acquiescing in the Croatian government's seizure of Sector West, the U.S. had, quote, in effect given the green light to the Bosnian Serbs to attack Srebrenica and Žepa. When Muslim paramilitary leader Nasser Oric launched an attack from Srebrenica against the Serbian village of Višnica, this time the surrounding Serbian forces counterattacked Srebrenica, entering the city.
It is well known to anybody who has followed this that Oric was launching repeated attacks out of a supposedly demilitarized zone against the surrounding Serbian areas around the Srebrenica enclave, to the point where, after repeated warnings, the Serbs simply could not allow him to continue to do that and decided to take the town.
Oric and several thousand of his soldiers fled across Serbian-held territory to the town of Tuzla several days before Serb forces entered Srebrenica and Žepa. Muslim women and children in Srebrenica were placed on buses by Serbian forces and sent to safety in Tuzla. But between 1,000 and 2,000 Muslim men were captured by the Serbs, who blamed them for participating in a string of massacres led by Nasser Oric. A Croatian soldier, who claims to have fought with the Bosnian Serbs, testified at The Hague that he took part in the execution of 1,200 Muslims, although the number of bodies recovered from the site was 200. UN Ambassador Madeleine Albright, however, used greatly inflated numbers to describe Serbian reprisals at Srebrenica. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, thousands of Muslim men, allegedly missing, were found serving in Muslim army units near Tuzla. Washington Post reporter John Pomfret reported that 4,000 armed Muslim soldiers had escaped to a town near Tuzla. Yet these same soldiers were still being included in official reports years later as missing Muslims from Srebrenica.
Secretary Albright in particular was very insistent on using such numbers like 8,000, 10,000 Muslim men and boys who were executed in Srebrenica by the Serbs. There's simply nothing to document those numbers.
During the first year of the Bosnian War, by all accounts the bloodiest period of the conflict, the Bosnian government placed the number of dead at 17,000. Within just 2 months, however, Bosnian government officials began using a figure of 200,000 killed. This huge increase in deaths came in the dead of winter, when fighting had virtually ceased in the mountainous terrain.
I'm probably as guilty as most of using inflated numbers, although I had enough sense to abandon using numbers in mid-93.
In a groundbreaking article which appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine in the fall of 1994, George Cheney criticized the way inflated casualty reports were used by most major news organizations.
A number of very high-profile journalists quickly picked up Bosnian government numbers and began to use them routinely. John Burns of the New York Times, Carol Williams of the LA Times, even John Pomfret of the Post, who's normally a very cautious journalist, got in on this after a certain period. So with these very well-respected journalists saying, okay, there have been 150,000, 250,000, 200,000, whatever, people killed, those were the numbers that stuck.
While the Bosnian government was using a figure of 200,000 deaths, International Red Cross observers on the ground were coming up with more realistic figures.
the International Committee of the Red Cross internally, and they've made it very clear that they're not going public with this, but their analysts were quite eager to talk with me and to be straightforward about their analysis. Their numbers are the lowest of any. They say 20 to 30,000 total with an upper limit of 35,000.
The figures now, it depends who you want to hear and believe. It's ranging around 300,000. Probably the truth of the matter is you'll be hard-pressed to find more than 30,000 graves. It's been exaggerated by that percentage.
Now, the European military intelligence would say, let's add in every possible hypothetical number of people that could be killed, and they get up to about 60,000. The U.S. intelligence community was sort of agnostic, saying the tens of thousands, but they didn't want to commit to any particular number, even unofficially.
As the U.S. government began to more actively assist Muslim and Croat forces, British intelligence accused the American CIA of doctoring intelligence reports to justify American intervention.
The CIA did a report that said 90% of the ethnic cleansing had been done by Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We now know that that study was only done in areas now held by Bosnian Serbs.
Serbs who were expelled from Muslim and Croat areas were not included in the CIA report, even though international agencies stated that 40% of the refugees from the war were Serbian.
Unless one assumes that the vast majority of Serb refugees left voluntarily and were not victims of ethnic cleansing, there's a very large disparity in the figures.
The study itself does not represent what actually happened throughout Bosnia-Herzegovina because it was not done in the other areas.
To acknowledge that ethnic cleansing has taken place on all sides in the struggle would muddy the waters. It would cast doubt on the status, for example, of the Bosnian Muslims as pure victims and the Serbs as pure aggressors.
The Bosnian government also used highly inflated numbers for incidents of rape.
We are talking about rape camps in which 14 to 30,000 women were raped and are being raped as we speak now.
Newsweek reporter Alexandra Stiegelmeier used the same numbers, but acknowledged she had no evidence to back up claims that 30 to 50,000 women had been raped in Bosnia.
Do you believe the numbers are credible?
They seem very high to me. And I don't believe the sources, because as I've investigated them, they always go back to one government or another.
A European Community Commission, which estimated that 20,000 women had been raped, dropped this claim from its final reports. After an exhaustive investigation, the UN concluded that 2,400 rapes had been committed by all three sides in the Bosnian conflict.
The Muslims have been represented as the victims and the Serbs as the aggressors. It should be remembered, however, the first blood shed in the struggle was Serb blood. 2 Muslim gunmen and 1 Croat stalked a Serb Orthodox wedding party in the heart of old Sarajevo. The father of the groom was killed. The Orthodox priest was wounded.
The killing of Nikola Gardovic on March 1st was a prelude to the war in Sarajevo. Despite promises from the government, the killers, who were well known, were not arrested. The following day, roadblocks were set up by both Muslims and Serbs. Unable to protect their civilian population, Serbs began to insist that predominantly Serbian areas of the city be controlled by their own police, or that Sarajevo become a UN protectorate. Muslims insisted on the Izetbegovic government's right to control not only Sarajevo, but all of Bosnia. To get the West to intervene, they needed to persuade Western public opinion that the Serbs were aggressors.
This is part of our history, it's part of our culture, it's promoted by the entertainment industry, and so in the scene of Bosnia we had to have a good guy and a bad guy, and we like to have a victim. So it was very easy there to say, wait a minute, the Muslims are the victims, the Serbs are the bad guys, and the Croatians are kind of the good guys because they're like us, and so on.
There was a sense that some of their reporting was censored to a certain line which was anti-Serb, as opposed to actually trying to create balance of what the Bosnians were doing at the same time.
The press would have us believe that the Serbs have seized 2/3 of Bosnia. The fact is the Serbs have lived in that territory for 1,500 years. Another fact is they are farmers and they are spread all over the landscape, so they have always been on 2/3 of the landscape.
The statement that has become an absolute cliche that the Serbs have taken over 70% of Bosnia. Again, the underlying assumption is that there were no Serbs in Bosnia before the conflict started, when in reality much of the land of Bosnia was Serb land before the fighting ever began.